Imagine standing on the deck of the most famous ship ever built. The ocean is almost completely dark. The wind is cold. The stars are shining above you. There is nothing in front of you except an endless black sea. And then, suddenly, someone looks ahead and sees something white. An iceberg. But by the time the iceberg is clearly visible, it is already too late. This is the story of the Titanic. But not the movie version. Not the romantic version. Not simply the story of a ship hitting an iceberg. This is the story of a series of small decisions, warnings, assumptions, and human mistakes that came together on one freezing night in April 1912. Because the Titanic did not sink because of one mistake. It sank because several things went wrong. One after another. Until there was almost no time left to fix them. On April 10, 1912, RMS Titanic began its maiden voyage from Southampton, England. The ship was enormous. At the time, it represented something more than transportation. It represented human confidence. People had entered an age where machines were becoming bigger, faster, and more powerful than ever before. Factories were growing. Cities were expanding. Steel ships were crossing oceans. And Titanic was designed to be among the greatest achievements of that age. She was over 880 feet long. She carried more than 2,000 people. Passengers included some of the wealthiest and most influential people of the time, as well as immigrants traveling toward a new life in America. For some passengers, the Titanic was a luxury hotel floating across the Atlantic. For others, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They believed they were beginning a journey toward something better. Nobody boarded the ship believing they were stepping into history. They thought they were simply traveling. That is one of the most haunting things about Titanic. History rarely announces itself while it is happening. The people on board did not know that every photograph they took, every meal they ate, every conversation they had, and every step they took across those decks would later become part of one of the world's most famous disasters. Titanic left Southampton on April 10. She later stopped at Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland, before beginning the Atlantic crossing toward New York. Everything seemed normal. The ship was powerful. The weather was mostly calm. Passengers enjoyed themselves. The dining rooms were filled with conversations. Music played. People walked along the decks. Some wrote letters. Some admired the ocean. Some dreamed about reaching America. And deep beneath all of that, the ship was moving toward a danger nobody could see. The North Atlantic in April was not a friendly place. The water was extremely cold. Icebergs could drift southward from Greenland. Ships crossing the Atlantic knew that ice existed in those waters. And Titanic was not completely unaware of the danger. During the voyage, wireless operators received warnings about ice. Other ships were reporting icebergs and dangerous conditions. This is where the story becomes more complicated. Because the Titanic was not sailing blindly into a completely unknown ocean. Warnings existed. But warnings are only useful when people recognize their importance and act on them. On April 14, Titanic continued westward. The ocean became unusually calm. At first, that sounds like good news. But calm water created a serious problem. When waves hit an iceberg, white foam can form around its base. That foam can make the iceberg easier to see. On a very calm sea, however, there may be little disturbance around the iceberg. The surface can look almost perfectly black. And on that night, the ocean was remarkably calm. The sky was also unusually clear. There was no moon bright enough to illuminate the water. The stars were shining intensely. It was beautiful. But beautiful conditions can sometimes hide dangerous conditions. Around 11:40 p.m., lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee spotted something ahead. At first, it was simply a dark shape. Then the shape became recognizable. An iceberg. Fleet immediately sounded the warning. The message reached the bridge. The ship's officers reacted. The engines were ordered to change. The helm was turned. The goal was to avoid the iceberg. But Titanic was enormous. And the ship was traveling at high speed. A giant ship does not behave like a small car. You cannot simply turn the steering wheel and instantly change direction. A ship that size needs time. It needs distance. And Titanic did not have enough of either. The iceberg came closer. The ship turned. For a moment, it seemed possible that Titanic might clear it. But then, the ship passed extremely close to the iceberg. There was contact. Not the dramatic explosion shown in many films. There was no giant mountain of ice smashing through the entire ship. Instead, the collision was much more subtle. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the ship. The damage was spread across several sections. And at first, many people on board did not even understand what had happened. Some passengers barely noticed. Some felt a vibration. Others heard a strange sound. But the ship was still moving. The lights were still on. The rooms were still warm. The dining rooms were still there. From inside the ship, it did not immediately look like a disaster. But below the waterline, something terrible had already begun. Water was entering the ship. And the ship's design depended on a crucial assumption. Titanic had watertight compartments. The idea was that if one section was damaged, watertight doors could help prevent water from spreading through the entire ship. This gave the vessel a major level of protection. But there was a limit. Titanic could remain afloat with a certain number of compartments flooded. The collision had damaged more sections than the ship could survive. The ship had been mortally wounded. And the people on board still had no idea how little time remained. Think about that for a moment. At 11:40 p.m., thousands of people were still living through an ordinary night. Parents were sleeping. Passengers were talking. Crew members were working. Somebody may have been reading. Someone else may have been writing a letter. A child may have been dreaming about arriving in New York. And beneath them, cold Atlantic water was entering the ship. The disaster had begun. But the real tragedy was not simply that Titanic hit an iceberg. The real tragedy was what happened after the collision. Because now the question was no longer, can Titanic avoid the iceberg? The question had become, can Titanic stay alive long enough for everyone to escape? And the answer was already becoming clear. The ship was going down. But nobody yet knew exactly how fast. And that uncertainty would become one of the most important parts of the story. Because when people don't believe a disaster is real, they don't immediately behave as if their lives are in danger. And on Titanic, that hesitation would cost precious time. The greatest ship of its age had less than 3 hours left. And the people on board were about to discover something terrifying. A ship can be enormous and still be helpless against nature. The iceberg had not destroyed Titanic instantly. It had done something much more frightening. It had started a countdown. And nobody could stop it. The Titanic was still standing. That was the problem. Because when people looked around them after the collision, they saw a ship that appeared almost normal. The lights were still burning. The furniture was still in place. The walls were still standing. The ship was not dramatically tilted. There was no immediate panic among everyone on board. To many passengers, the collision did not feel like the beginning of the end. It felt like an inconvenience. Some passengers even joked about it. Others wondered whether the ship had simply hit some ice. But below them, engineers were trying to understand the damage. And what they discovered was devastating. The Titanic had been designed with multiple watertight compartments. These compartments were separated by bulkheads intended to slow the movement of water. But watertight did not mean invincible. The damage had extended across too many compartments. Water was entering areas that could not remain flooded without affecting the ship's ability to stay afloat. The bow began to sink lower. As the bow dropped, the situation became worse. Water could begin to move over the tops of bulkheads into neighboring compartments. The ship's fate was becoming a matter of physics. There was no enemy. No explosion. No battle. No person standing outside trying to destroy the ship. Just water. Gravity. Steel. And time. Captain Edward Smith understood the seriousness of the situation. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, also assessed the damage. The conclusion was horrifying. Titanic could not remain afloat indefinitely. The ship would sink. Now the next challenge was getting people into lifeboats. And this is where another major problem appeared. Titanic carried lifeboats, but not enough for everyone aboard. This was legal under the regulations of the time. The rules were based largely on the ship's size rather than the total number of people it carried. Titanic had more lifeboat capacity than the law required. But there was still nowhere near enough space for everyone. That fact would become one of the most important failures in the entire disaster. The ship had been designed to carry thousands of people. It had luxurious rooms, powerful engines, advanced communication equipment, multiple safety systems. But there were not enough lifeboat seats for everyone. Imagine realizing that only after the ship is already sinking. The crew began preparing the lifeboats. Passengers were told to put on life jackets. But another problem appeared. Many people did not immediately understand the seriousness of the situation. Why would they? They were standing on what was supposed to be one of the safest and most advanced ships in the world. The Titanic had a reputation for strength. That reputation influenced how people reacted. Some passengers were reluctant to leave the warm ship and enter a small lifeboat floating on a freezing ocean. Others were unsure whether the lifeboats were actually necessary. The crew had to convince people to board. And that took time. Precious time. The first lifeboat was launched with far fewer people than its full capacity. This was not because the crew wanted empty seats. It was because people were hesitant. Some passengers did not want to leave. Some believed the Titanic was safer than the small boats. Some did not understand that there would be no second chance. This is one of the most important lessons of the Titanic story. A disaster does not always begin with screaming. Sometimes it begins with disbelief. People often imagine that when danger arrives, everyone immediately understands it. Real life is different. The human mind can resist information that feels impossible. If someone tells you that the building you are standing inside is about to collapse, your first reaction may not be to run. Your first reaction may be, "Are you sure?" That psychological delay happened on Titanic. And while people were deciding whether to leave, the ship was sinking. The wireless operators were sending distress messages. The Titanic's wireless room became one of the most important places on the ship. Messages were sent asking nearby ships for help. The famous distress call was transmitted. But communication in 1912 was not what it is today. There were no smartphones. No GPS. No instant global communication. A ship could be only a few miles away and still be unaware of what was happening. The nearest ship capable of helping Titanic quickly enough was the Carpathia. But it was not right beside Titanic. It had to turn around and race toward the sinking ship. And the ocean was enormous. Even at full speed, help would take hours. Titanic did not have hours. Meanwhile, another issue was becoming critical. The lifeboats. The crew had to decide who would board first. Women and children were generally given priority. But even that was not simple. Some families refused to separate. Some passengers were reluctant to leave loved ones behind. Some people could not even reach the lifeboats quickly because they did not understand where to go. The ship had multiple decks and complicated internal spaces. Passengers in different classes had very different access to parts of the ship. For third-class passengers especially, the journey toward the boat deck could be more complicated. The disaster was not experienced equally by everyone. The Titanic carried people from completely different social and economic backgrounds. There were wealthy passengers traveling in luxury. There were working-class passengers traveling toward a new life. There were crew members who were simply doing their jobs. When the ship began sinking, all of those social differences suddenly became much less important. The ocean did not care about wealth. It did not care about status. It did not care about the room number on your ticket. But the evacuation process was still affected by the structure of society. Some passengers had easier access to information. Some had better access to the upper decks. Some did not speak English fluently. Some did not know what was happening. And some simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. As more lifeboats were launched, the reality became impossible to ignore. The Titanic was sinking. The bow was lower. The deck angle was changing. The night was getting colder. And the ocean around the ship was almost completely black. The lifeboats were moving away from the ship. People in those boats could look back and see Titanic's lights glowing against the darkness. Imagine what that must have looked like. A massive ship that had seemed almost indestructible, now slowly disappearing into the Atlantic. And yet, many people were still on board. There were not enough lifeboats. The Carpathia was still racing toward them. And the water was becoming more dangerous with every passing minute. The Titanic's crew continued trying to maintain order. This mattered. Because thousands of people were facing a situation they had never imagined. The ship was not designed for everyone to escape at once. The lifeboats had to be lowered individually. The crew had to organize passengers. The wireless operators had to continue communicating. Engineers were working below decks. Officers were directing people. Musicians continued playing for a time, trying to keep people calm. The story of the musicians has become legendary because it represents something deeply human. When everything around you is falling apart. Sometimes people try to create order through small acts of courage. Music cannot stop an iceberg. Music cannot pump water out of a sinking ship. But it can give frightened people a moment of calm. And that is what many people on Titanic desperately needed. A moment. Because time was disappearing. Around 1 a.m., the situation was becoming increasingly serious. Around 1:30 a.m., the ship's condition was clearly critical. The lifeboats were being launched. But the number of people still on board remained enormous. And the ocean around them was freezing. If someone entered that water, survival would be extremely difficult. The problem was no longer simply reaching a lifeboat. The problem was reaching one before the ship became impossible to escape. The Titanic had begun the night as a symbol of confidence. Now it was becoming a symbol of human vulnerability. And perhaps the most frightening part was this. There was still no way to stop the sinking. The ship could not turn around. It could not fly. It could not call for an immediate rescue helicopter. There was no modern emergency system waiting to save everyone. There were only lifeboats. Wireless messages. And the hope that another ship would arrive in time. The Carpathia was coming. But the Titanic was running out of time. And the final hour was about to begin. By the early hours of April 15, 1912, the Titanic was no longer simply damaged. It was dying. The ship's bow had sunk noticeably lower into the Atlantic. The stern was rising. The angle of the decks was becoming more obvious. And thousands of people were beginning to understand the truth. There would not be enough lifeboats. Not everyone would survive. For many passengers, this realization came far too late. The Titanic's greatest strength had become part of the tragedy. It was enormous. It was comfortable. It was designed to make people feel safe. And that feeling of safety had delayed some people's reaction. But now the illusion was gone. The crew continued loading lifeboats. Some were filled more completely than earlier boats. Others left with empty seats. Every boat that disappeared into the darkness represented two different emotions. For the people inside it. Relief. For the people left behind. Fear. From the lifeboats, passengers could look back at the Titanic. Her windows were glowing. The ship was still illuminated. That made the scene even more surreal. It did not look like a wreck. It looked like a giant building floating in the ocean. But the ocean was slowly taking it. Inside the ship, people were moving toward the upper decks. Some families stayed together. Some people searched for loved ones. Crew members continued giving instructions. Others prayed. Some simply stood quietly. There are moments in history when words become almost useless. This was one of them. People had spent years building Titanic. Engineers had calculated its strength. Workers had constructed its enormous hull. Designers had created luxurious interiors. Companies had invested enormous amounts of money. Passengers had purchased tickets. Families had said goodbye at the docks. And now, all of that human effort was being tested by the ocean. The wireless operators continued sending messages. The distress calls were being received by other ships. The Carpathia was racing toward Titanic. But distance remained the enemy. The Carpathia was doing everything it could. Its engines were pushed hard. The ship navigated through dangerous waters. But it could not simply appear beside Titanic. The ocean did not care how urgently people needed help. The Carpathia was still hours away when Titanic's situation became critical. This is why communication alone could not save everyone. A message can travel faster than a ship. The words, "We are sinking," can cross the ocean in seconds. But the people who receive those words may still be hundreds of miles away. And that is exactly what happened. The final lifeboats were launched. The number of people remaining on Titanic decreased. But hundreds were still aboard. The ship's stern continued rising. The angle became steeper. People had to hold on to railings and structures to maintain balance. The atmosphere became chaotic. But even during chaos, many people continued showing extraordinary courage. Crew members helped passengers. People gave up places. Parents stayed with children. Families refused to separate. There were acts of selfishness too. There were moments of confusion. There were moments when fear overcame people. The Titanic disaster was not a story of perfect heroes and perfect villains. It was a story about ordinary human beings facing an extraordinary situation. Some were brave. Some were frightened. Some made mistakes. Some sacrificed themselves. Some simply tried to survive. That is what makes the story meaningful. Because the people on Titanic were not characters in a movie. They were human beings. They had birthdays. They had families. They had problems. They had plans for the future. Some were traveling to start businesses. Some were going home. Some were immigrating to America. Some were returning from Europe. They expected another morning. They expected breakfast. They expected to see New York. They expected life to continue. But history was about to divide their lives into two parts. Before Titanic. And after Titanic. Around 2 a.m., the ship was in terrible condition. The forward part was deeply submerged. The stern was high above the water. The ship was under enormous structural stress. And there was almost no time left. The last people on board faced an impossible choice. Stay on the ship. Or try to reach the lifeboats. But most of the lifeboats were already gone. The darkness of the Atlantic surrounded them. The cold was severe. The ship's lights still burned. And the sound of the ocean seemed almost insignificant compared with the size of the ship. Then the situation became even more extreme. Titanic's stern continued to rise. The ship was no longer in a normal position. People struggled to stay upright. Objects moved. Furniture shifted. The ship's structure was under enormous pressure. And then, the lights went out. For a moment, the enormous ship disappeared into darkness. The Titanic that had once looked so powerful was now almost completely swallowed by the night. The ship broke apart during its final descent. The bow disappeared beneath the Atlantic. The stern followed. And by approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, the Titanic was gone. The ocean became quiet. The great ship had disappeared. Thousands of people were now separated into two groups. Those in lifeboats. And those who had been left in the freezing Atlantic. The lifeboats drifted in the darkness. Some passengers heard cries from the water. The scene was unbearable. But there was little they could do. The boats were small. They had limited capacity. Returning toward a large number of people in the water could put the survivors already inside the boat at risk. Some boats did eventually return toward people in the water. But by then, the cold had already taken a terrible toll. This is one of the most painful truths about the Titanic. The iceberg itself did not directly cause every death. The freezing ocean became the final danger. The people who survived the sinking still faced an enormous weight. The Carpathia was coming. But it had not arrived yet. Imagine sitting in a small lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic. You have just watched the ship you believed was nearly indestructible disappear. You are surrounded by darkness. You don't know exactly where you are. You don't know whether another ship will find you. You don't know how many people survived. And you don't know what the next hour will bring. That was the reality for the survivors. Then, finally, a light appeared on the horizon. The Carpathia had arrived. For the people in the lifeboats, that light represented something almost impossible to describe. Hope. The rescue operation began. One by one, survivors were taken aboard. People searched for family members. Some were reunited. Others were not. For those who had lost loved ones, the rescue was not a happy ending. It was only the beginning of grief. By the time the Carpathia left the area, hundreds of people had been rescued. But more than 1,500 people had died. The Titanic had carried more than 2,000 people. Only a portion survived. The ship was gone. The disaster was over. But the story was only beginning. Because once the world learned what had happened, people began asking questions. How could the Titanic sink? Why were there not enough lifeboats? Why did warnings about ice not prevent the disaster? Why was the ship traveling so fast through an ice region? Why did some lifeboats leave without being completely filled? Why did rescue take so long? And perhaps the biggest question of all. Was the Titanic disaster really caused by one iceberg? Or was the iceberg simply the final piece in a much larger chain of failures? The answer would change maritime safety forever. Because the world was about to discover that Titanic was not simply a tragedy. It was a warning. A warning about technology. A warning about confidence. A warning about human judgment. And a warning about what happens when we believe that something is too powerful to fail. But there was another mystery that would remain. Why was the iceberg seen so late? Why did the ship have so little time to react? And what happened during those final seconds on the bridge? To understand that, we have to go back to the moment when the iceberg first appeared. Because the most important part of the Titanic story may not be what happened after the collision. It may be what happened in the seconds before it. And that is where the real mystery begins. The Titanic disaster is often reduced to one sentence. The ship hit an iceberg and sank. But that sentence hides almost everything that matters. Because an iceberg alone does not explain Titanic. A ship can encounter an iceberg and survive. A ship can receive an ice warning and slow down. A ship can carry enough lifeboats to save everyone. A nearby vessel can respond quickly. A crew can make different decisions. Titanic was the result of many factors coming together. And that is what makes the story so powerful. The iceberg was real. The collision was real. But the disaster was much bigger than the collision itself. The lookouts had very little time to identify the iceberg and warn the bridge. The sea was unusually calm. There was no moon illuminating the water. The iceberg was difficult to see against the dark horizon. Titanic was also traveling quickly. Every second mattered. The ship's enormous size meant it could not turn instantly. And when the collision occurred, the damage was enough to doom the ship. But perhaps the most important lesson is what happened before the iceberg. Warnings about ice had been received. The Titanic was not the only ship in the North Atlantic. Other vessels were reporting dangerous ice conditions. Yet the Titanic continued its voyage. This does not mean that everyone on the ship simply ignored warnings. The situation was more complicated than that. At the time, ships had different ways of handling ice reports. Wireless communication was still relatively new. Messages were transmitted by radio operators, but those operators also had to deal with passenger telegrams and other communication. Not every ice report received the same attention. Not every warning was treated as an emergency. And that is a lesson that applies far beyond the Titanic. A warning does not automatically save someone. The warning must be understood. It must be believed. And most importantly, someone must act on it. Titanic became a symbol of what can happen when confidence becomes greater than caution. The ship was not literally advertised as impossible to sink in the simple way that popular culture sometimes suggests. But the reputation surrounding the ship was enormous. People believed they were traveling aboard one of the safest vessels ever built. That belief mattered. Because when people believe something is extremely safe, they may behave differently. They may take fewer precautions. They may underestimate danger. And this is not unique to ships. It happens everywhere. A person becomes confident because a machine has never failed before. A company becomes confident because its product has always worked. A driver becomes confident because they have driven the same road many times. A society becomes confident because technology has solved problem after problem. Then one day, something unexpected happens. Titanic was not defeated by a monster. It was defeated by a combination of nature, physics, human decisions, technology, and time. That is why the story still matters more than a century later. After the disaster, investigations were conducted in both the United States and Britain. Questions were asked about the ship's speed. Questions were asked about the iceberg warnings. Questions were asked about lifeboats. Questions were asked about wireless communication. Questions were asked about the actions of the crew. And the disaster led to major changes in maritime safety. One of the most important lessons was obvious. There must be enough lifeboat capacity for everyone. Another was the importance of maintaining continuous radio watch. Ships also became more careful about ice. The International Ice Patrol was established to monitor iceberg danger in the North Atlantic. Maritime safety standards changed. The disaster helped push the world toward stronger rules. This is one of the strange things about history. Sometimes progress is built from tragedy. People learn because something terrible happened to someone else. The Titanic was lost. But the lessons from Titanic helped make future voyages safer. The wreck itself remained underwater for decades. Then, in 1985, the wreck of Titanic was discovered on the floor of the North Atlantic by a joint American-French expedition. The discovery brought the Titanic back into public attention. For decades, the ship had existed mainly through photographs, survivor stories, books, and memories. Now the actual wreck could be studied. Scientists and historians could examine what remained. And the deeper researchers looked, the more complicated the story became. Titanic was not just a ship. It was a time capsule. Inside the story were the beliefs of an entire generation. It represented the industrial age. It represented wealth, class, migration, engineering, human ambition, and the belief that technology could overcome almost anything. That is why Titanic became more than a maritime disaster. It became a symbol. A symbol of the limits of human confidence. Think about the people who boarded Titanic. They were not trying to become part of history. They were simply living. A wealthy passenger might have been thinking about business. An immigrant might have been thinking about a new home. A crew member might have been thinking about finishing their shift. A family might have been excited about seeing relatives in America. They had plans. And that is something we often forget when we study historical disasters. The people who died were not numbers. They were individuals. Each person had a story. Each person had people who loved them. Each person believed there would be a tomorrow. And that is perhaps the deepest meaning behind Titanic. We often think the lesson is, don't underestimate icebergs. But the real lesson is much bigger. Don't assume that because something is powerful, it is invincible. Don't confuse confidence with safety. Don't ignore warnings simply because nothing bad has happened yet. Don't wait until danger becomes obvious before taking it seriously. And don't believe that technology can remove every risk from life. The Titanic was one of the greatest achievements of its time. And yet, it could not control the ocean. That is the contradiction at the heart of the story. Human beings built a ship that was hundreds of feet long. They created engines powerful enough to move it across the Atlantic. They filled it with luxury. They equipped it with wireless communication. They created sophisticated systems to keep water from spreading. And still, nature found a weakness. The iceberg did not need to destroy the entire ship. It only needed to damage enough of it. That is another powerful lesson. Sometimes destruction does not come from one enormous event. Sometimes it comes from a small weakness repeated across several systems. One warning is missed. One assumption is wrong. One decision is delayed. One safety measure is insufficient. One emergency plan is incomplete. Individually, each mistake may seem manageable. Together, they can become catastrophic. That is what happened to Titanic. And that is why the question in the title matters. The iceberg appeared too late. It appeared late enough that the ship had almost no time to react. But perhaps the deeper truth is this. The iceberg was not the first warning. It was the final warning. By the time the iceberg became visible, the consequences of earlier decisions were already locked into place. The ship's speed. The sea conditions. The warnings. The design. The lifeboat capacity. The evacuation process. The distance from help. Everything mattered. And when all those factors met on one freezing night, the Titanic sank. Today, we know the ending. But imagine being there on April 14, 1912. Imagine standing on the deck, looking at the ocean, seeing the stars, feeling the cold wind, hearing people talking around you, and knowing nothing about what is coming. That is what makes history so powerful. We know the ending. They didn't. For them, the future was still open. For them, New York was still ahead. For them, tomorrow still belonged to them. Then, in a matter of hours, everything changed. The Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic. But the story never disappeared. It survived through the people who lived. It survived through the families who remembered. It survived through investigators. It survived through photographs. It survived through books. And eventually, it survived through film and television. More than a century later, people are still asking the same questions. How could it happen? Why wasn't it prevented? Could more people have survived? What could have been different? We may never have perfect answers. But perhaps we do not need a perfect answer to understand the lesson. The Titanic reminds us that human beings are capable of incredible achievements. But achievement does not make us invincible. Technology can make us stronger. It can make us faster. It can make our lives safer. But it cannot remove uncertainty from the world. There will always be things we cannot completely control. The ocean. The weather. Nature. Time. And sometimes, our own decisions. That is why the story of Titanic still matters. Not because a famous ship sank, but because the people on that ship believed they were moving toward the future. And none of them knew that their final journey would become one of the most remembered nights in human history. The iceberg was only one piece of the story. The real story was human. Human ambition. Human confidence. Human error. Human courage. Human fear. And human hope. The Titanic disappeared into the ocean. But its warning remained above the surface. And perhaps that is the final lesson. The greatest danger is not always the thing we can see. Sometimes the greatest danger is the warning we decide is not important. Because when the iceberg finally becomes visible, there may already be no time left to turn. And that night, on a dark and freezing Atlantic Ocean, there wasn't.